We brought together 3 groups of kids at this day camp and showed them pictures of 2 men, one Arab, the other Asian.
Who do you like better, this man or this man?
The Chinese guy.
Over and over, they said they liked the Asian man more than the Arab.
He looks meaner and he looks nicer.
Because he looks nicer?
Yeah, he does look nicer. And he has a smile on.
But both men are smiling. And what did the kids think about the personalities of the men?
Let me ask, you don't know this person, but what do you think he's like?
I think he's weird.
Why is he weird?
He just doesn't look like a very nice person, no.
He looks like a scary dude.
He's on the phone. What's he talking about?
Maybe a robbery?
Then I ask about the Asian man.
What's he like?
He looks like a regular teenager to me.
We then showed them pictures of a black man and a white man. What were some comments about the black man?
And he looks mean. FBI most wanted. He looks weird. He looks like he's a basketball player.
So, tell me about this guy. Does he seem like a nice person?
I think he's nice. I think he's nice, except he might be mad about something.
He was probably picking up on something. This is Oklahoma City bomber Timothy McVeigh. But when we ask which man is a criminal, most kids pointed to the black man. And when we asked which was a teacher, they said,
That one! The guy in the green shirt.
Why do we stereotype? We stereotype because we get used to, at a very young age, seeing the world in terms of categories. Objects, animals, furniture. It's our way of navigating a complicated social universe. We have to rely on a variety of cognitive shortcuts to get through our day. Cognitive shortcuts save us time, save us energy. They also lead us down the road of stereotyping. When we jump to conclusions about an object based on its characteristics, there are very few repercussions. When we jump to conclusions about an individual based on her or his group membership, there are repercussions. People resent that, we don't always make good decisions, and there are real social costs to that. The keys to mitigating stereotyping are first and foremost to acknowledge that it happens and to understand and recognize that even those of us who are motivated to be fair-minded individuals fall victim to stereotyping. Being aware of the process as it plays out is one of the keys to attenuating the tendency to judge others based on stereotypes.
Bingo. Asians.
You can't be serious.
You never get behind people traveling with infants. Never seen a stroller collapse in less than 20 minutes. Old people are worse. Their bodies are littered with hidden metal, and they never seem to appreciate how little time they have left on Earth. Here you go. 5 words, randomly selected for additional screening. Asians. They pack light, travel efficiently, and they got a thing for slip-on shoes. God love them.
That's racist.
Unlike my mother, I stereotype. It's faster.
From now on, I too will be abstinent. I'll be as untouched as the turn signal in an Asian woman's car.
How much signal I need to cut across 8 lanes? None? I turn now. Good luck, everybody else!
Return to Japanese girls think small versions of things are really cute.
Oh, look at my tiny dog. I'm gonna put it in my tiny purse. Tiny phone. Tiny everything. Peter, have you seen...
You're like a black woman in hindsight.
I told you. What did I tell you? Didn't I tell you? 'Cause I told you. And when did I tell you? A long time ago. And what did I say will happen when I told you? Exactly what just happened.
Yes, I suppose so. Listen, why don't we head back to my place, grab a bite to eat, and watch the big curling match on TV? Canada's in the World Final against Mexico.
No, 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 no.
There you go, being confident, like an Italian guy in any given theoretical situation.
If that was me, I'm just saying, if that was me, they are lucky that was not me. Because if the circumstances were such as you have described them, but with me in them, that's a very different and scary outcome for those involved.
Yeah, I mean, we're tighter than an Asian family.
You doctor yet?
No, Dad, I'm 12.
Talk to me when you doctor.
We now return to...
I say, Ahmed, what is that thing you people do when you're about to assassinate an infidel?
Ah, you mean this?
Oh, God, yes, I love that.
My name is Canwin, and I play both the piano and the violin. I aspire to someday be a doctor, and my favorite subject is calculus. My mom and dad are tiger parents who won't let me go to sleepovers, but they make up for it by serving my favorite meal every single day: rice. And I'm a really bad driver. So my question for you now is, how long did it take you to figure out I was joking? As you've probably guessed, today I'm going to talk about race, and I'll start off by sharing with you my story of growing up Asian American. I moved to the United States when I was 2 years old, so almost my entire life has been a blend of two cultures. I eat pasta with chopsticks, am addicted to orange chicken, and my childhood hero was Yao Ming. But having grown up in North Dakota, South Dakota, and Idaho, all states with incredibly little racial diversity, it was difficult to reconcile my so-called exotic Chinese heritage with my mainstream American self. Used to being the only Asian in the room, I was self-conscious that the first thing people noticed about me was that I wasn't white. And as a child, I quickly began to realize that I had two options in front of me: conform to the stereotype that was expected of me, or conform to the whiteness that surrounded me. There was no in-between. For me, this meant that I always felt self-conscious about being good at math because people would just say it was because I was Asian and not because I actually worked hard. It meant that whenever a boy asked me out, it was because he had the yellow fever and not because he actually liked me. It meant that for the longest time, my identity had formed around the fact that I was different, and I thought that being Asian was the only special thing about me. These effects were emphasized by the places where I lived. Don't get me wrong, only a small percentage of people were actually racist or even borderline racist, but the vast majority were just a little bit clueless. Now, I know you're probably thinking, what's the difference? Well, here's an example. Not racist can sound like I'm white and you're not. Racist can sound like I'm white, you're not, and that makes me better than you. But clueless sounds like I'm white, you're not, and I don't know how to deal with that. Now, I don't doubt for a second that these clueless people are still nice individuals with great intentions, but they do ask some questions that become pretty annoying after a while. Here are a few examples. You're Chinese? Oh my goodness, I have a Chinese friend. Do you know him? No, I don't know him. Because contrary to your unrealistic expectations, I do not know every single one of the 1.35 billion Chinese people who live on planet Earth. People also tend to ask, where does your name come from? And I really don't know how to answer that, so I usually just stick with the truth. My parents gave it to me. Where does your name come from? Don't even get me started on how many times people have confused me with a different Asian person. One time, someone came up to me and said, "Angie, I love your artwork," and I was super confused, so I just thanked them and walked away. But out of all of the questions, my favorite one is still the classic, "Where are you from?" Because I've lived in quite a few places, so this is how the conversation usually goes. Where are you from? Oh, I'm from Boise, Idaho. I see, but where are you really from? I lived in South Dakota for a while. Okay, what about before that? I lived in North Dakota. Okay, I'm just gonna cut straight to the chase here. I guess what I'm saying is, have you ever lived anywhere far away from here where people talk a little differently? Oh, I know what you're talking about. Yes, I have. I used to live in Texas. By then, they usually have just given up and wonder to themselves why I'm not one of the cool Asians like Jeremy Lin or Jackie Chan, or they skip the needless banter and go straight for the "where is your family from?" So just an FYI for all of you out there, that is the safest strategy. But as amusing as these interactions were, oftentimes they made me want to reject my own culture because I thought it helped me conform. I distanced myself from the Asian stereotype as much as possible by degrading my own race and pretending I hated math. And the worst part was, it worked. The more I rejected my Chinese identity, the more popular I became. My peers liked me more because I was more similar to them. I became more confident because I knew I was more similar to them. But as I became more and more Americanized, I also began to lose bits and pieces of myself, parts of me that I could never get back. And no matter how much I tried to pretend that I was the same as my American classmates, I wasn't. Because for people who have lived in the places where I lived, white is the norm, and for me, white became the norm too. For my 14th birthday, I received the video game Sims 3, which lets you create your own characters and control their lives. My 14-year-old self created the perfect little mainstream family, complete with a huge mansion and enormous swimming pool. I binge played the game for about 3 months, then put it away and never really thought about it again until a few weeks ago when I came to a sudden realization. The family that I had custom designed was white. The character that I had designed for myself was white. Everyone I had designed was white. And the worst part was, this was by no means a conscious decision that I had made. Never once did I think to myself that I could actually make the characters look like me. Without even thinking, white had become my norm too. The truth is, Asian Americans play a strange role in the American melting pot. We are the model minority. Society uses our success to pit us against other people of color as justification that racism doesn't exist. But what does that mean for us Asian Americans? It means that we aren't quite similar enough to be accepted, but we aren't different enough to be loathed. We are in a perpetually gray zone, and society isn't quite sure what to do with us. So they group us by the color of our skin. They tell us that we must reject our own heritages so we can fit in with the crowd. They tell us that our foreignness is the only identifying characteristic of us. They strip away our identities one by one until we are foreign but not quite foreign, American but not quite American, individual but only when there are no other people from our native country around. I wish that I had always had the courage to speak out about these issues. But coming from one culture that avoids confrontation and another that is divided over race, how do I overcome the pressure to keep the peace while also staying true to who I am? And as much as I hate to admit it, oftentimes I don't speak out, because if I do, it's at the risk of being told that I'm too sensitive, or that I get offended too easily, or that it's just not worth it. But at what point are people willing to admit that, yes, race issues are controversial, but that's precisely the reason why we need to talk about them? I just turned 18, and there are still so many things that I don't know about the world, but what I do know is that it's hard to admit that you might be part of the problem, that all of us might be part of the problem. So instead of giving you a step-by-step guide on how to not be racist towards Asians, I will let you decide what to take from this talk. All I can do is share my story. My name is Canwin, my favorite color is purple, and I play the piano but not so much the violin. I have 2 incredibly supportive, hardworking parents, and 1 very awesome 10-year-old brother. I love calculus more than anything, despise eating rice, and I'm a horrendous driver. But most of all, I am proud of who I am. A little bit American, a little bit Chinese, and a whole lot of both. Thank you.
It's easy to put people in boxes. There's us, and there's them. The high earners, and those just getting by. Those we trust, and those we try to avoid. There's the new Danes, and those who've always been here. The people from the countryside, and those who've never seen a cow. The religious, and the self-confident. There are those we share something with, and those we don't share anything with.
Velkommen. Jeg kommer til at stille jer nogle spørgsmål i dag. Nogle af dem kan godt være lidt personlige, men jeg håber, I vil svare ærligt på dem. Hvem herinde i rummet var klassens klovn? Hvem er bonusforældre?
And then suddenly, there's us. We who believe in life after death. We who've seen UFOs. And all of us who love to dance. We who've been bullied. And we who've bullied others. And then there's us, the lucky ones who've had sex this past week. We who are broken-hearted. We who are madly in love. We who feel lonely. We who are bisexual. And we who acknowledge the courage of others. We who have found the meaning of life. And we who have saved lives. And then there's all of us who just love Denmark. So maybe there's more that brings us together than we think. TV2 Denmark. All that we share.
Welcome to the MCAT Multimedia Series, a MCAT analysis of Gordon Allport's The Nature of Prejudice. How do we form perceptions and opinions about the people around us, whether right or wrong? Emotions, experiences, social influences, and historical legacies all play a part. But is the fundamental source of prejudice something that's deeply ingrained in the human psychology? The American psychologist Gordon Allport published The Nature of Prejudice in 1954. It was an influential study that explored the root causes of a stubborn problem. Allport considered all factors related to prejudice, but came to the conclusion that stereotypical categorization is present historically throughout all types of cultures. He put forward a theory, the least effort principle, to explain this, suggesting that all human brains use stereotyping as a normal cognitive function to process information, a kind of mental shortcut to understand the world. Was Allport right? Do our minds stereotype people thanks to an inbuilt blueprint? Let's consider a job position and the selection process that determines who will fill that role. A manager will be making judgments about job applications based on a limited number of factors under time constraints. They'll rely on resumes, references, test scores, and interviews. Short of giving every candidate a trial period in the position, using up valuable money, business resources, and time, there is no way of guaranteeing the best person is chosen. So, how does the manager decide? Allport's least effort principle is used. Assumptions are made about each candidate using the limited information that the manager has been presented with, how a candidate was dressed, how punctual they were, or how well their resume was written. If the candidate was scruffy and unkempt, the manager might assume they were disorganized or haphazard. If they were late for the interview, a manager might assume that they have bad timekeeping skills. All these assumptions are stereotyped perceptions based on preconceived ideas rather than on fact. It could be that the scruffy candidate was in fact very organized, or the late applicant was held up through no fault of their own. But in the case of the job applications, stereotypes fill in the gaps and enable the manager to make a decision without using valuable business resources. Although stereotyping is used by the brain to reach conclusions, it is often not a reasonable or accurate way to form an opinion. Allport therefore theorized that stereotypes were the foundation of prejudice, which was in turn the primary cause of discrimination. He suggested that, contrary to much of the writing of the time, there was no reasonable basis for prejudice. It was an idea of profound implications for law and society. Gordon Allport's text is seen as a classic. It provides relevant insight into the prejudices that still permeate modern society today. A more detailed examination can be found in the McCat analysis.
We've all been unfairly judged at some point in our life. And let's not pretend that we haven't done our fair share of uninformed judging too. Prejudice is prejudgment, or forming an opinion before becoming aware of the relevant facts. This unconscious bias is a typical human behaviour, and we all do it to some degree. Problems occur when we're in situations where this prejudging behaviour influences our decisions and leads us to discriminate. There are many instances where this can happen. However, we're going to look at the impact of prejudgment when making decisions based on employee conduct. Imagine you're about to have a discussion with an employee about the fact that they had arrived late for work for the third time that week. Ideally, your conversation would reflect just that. The problem is, you already have a few prejudged thoughts about Bob, and about lateness in general. These prejudged thoughts can influence the way you approach a situation, if you allow them to continue unchecked. So you can see that prejudged thoughts can have a real impact on the person being judged, as well as your ability to manage issues effectively. We can't throw out our bias and prejudgment completely, but it's always best to stop and think before you act. Don't let your bias take precedent over rational thinking.
In February 1999, 4 New York City police officers were on patrol in the Bronx when they saw a young black man standing on a stoop. They thought he looked suspicious. When they pulled over, he retreated into the doorway and began digging in his pocket. He kept digging as the police shouted at him to show his hands. A few seconds later, the man, Amadou Diallo, a 23-year-old immigrant from Guinea, was dead, hit by 19 of the 41 bullets that the police fired at him. What Diallo was reaching for was his wallet. He was going for his ID as he stood on the steps of his own apartment building. Diallo's story and the officer's fatal prejudgment of him is recounted in Malcolm Gladwell's 2005 bestseller, Blink. Gladwell and the social psychologist whose work he draws upon explores Diallo's case as an example of that gray area between deliberate violence and an accident, propagated by non-conscious or implicit biases. The officers did discriminate against Diallo, but the prejudice they acted on may have been driven by something more subtle than simple hatred. And that's an important thing to think about. Yes, there are lots of overtly bigoted people and policies at work all over the world, but what we're interested in today is the more insidious, non-conscious, automatic bias, and how it can affect our behavior. The fact is, our implicit biases affect the way we relate to others in a very real way. Our race, gender, age, religion, or sexual orientation can make the difference between whether we get a job or not, a fair paycheck or a good rental, or whether we get randomly pulled over or shot and killed for reaching for a wallet. In the last 2 episodes, we've examined how we think about and how we influence one another, but social psychology is also about how we relate to one another. Like what factors might cause us to help another person, or harm them, or fear them? What are the social and cognitive and emotional roots of prejudice, racism, and sexism, and how do they shape our society? These are some of the aspects of ourselves that are the hardest and most uncomfortable for us to explore, which is why they're so important to understand. We've all been unfairly judged in our time, and let's not pretend that we haven't done our fair share of uninformed judging too. Like it or not, prejudice is a common human condition. Prejudice just means prejudgment. It's an unjustified, typically negative attitude toward an individual or group. Prejudicial attitudes are often directed along the lines of gender, ethnic, socioeconomic status, or culture. And by definition, prejudice is not the same thing as stereotyping or discrimination, although the 3 phenomena are intimately related. People may distrust a female mechanic. That's a prejudicial attitude, but it's rooted in a stereotype, or overgeneralized belief about a particular group. Although it's often discussed in a negative way, stereotyping is really more of a general cognitive process that doesn't have to be negative. It can even be accurate at times. Like, I have the stereotype that all crows have wings, injuries and birth defects aside, and that happens to be true. But on the negative end, your prejudice against female mechanics may be rooted in some inaccurate stereotype about women's skills with a socket wrench. And when stereotypical beliefs combine with prejudicial attitudes and emotions, like fear and hostility, they can drive the behavior we call discrimination. So a prejudiced person won't necessarily act on their attitude. Say you believe in the stereotype that overweight people are lazy. You might then feel a prejudiced distaste when you see someone who appears overweight. But if you act on your prejudice and say refuse to hire them for a job or don't let them sit at your lunch counter, then you've crossed over into discriminating against them. The former apartheid system of racial segregation in South Africa, the Nazis' mass killing of gypsies, Jewish people, and other groups, and centuries of bloodshed between Protestants and Catholics are all extreme examples of violent prejudice and discrimination. The good news is that in many cultures, certain forms of overt prejudice have waned over time. For example, in 1937, only 1/3 of Americans said that they'd vote for a qualified woman to be president, while in 2007, that figure was up to nearly 90%. But of course, more subtle prejudices can still linger. In the past, we've talked about dual process theories of thought, memory, and attitudes, in that while we're aware of our explicit thoughts, our implicit cognition still operates under the radar, leaving us clueless about its effect on our attitudes and behavior. In the same way, prejudice can be non-conscious and automatic. And I mean, it can be so non-conscious that even when people ask us point blank about our attitudes, we unwillingly or unknowingly don't always give them an honest answer. Do you think that men are better at science than women, or that Muslims are more violent than Christians, or that overweight people are unhealthy? Our tendency to unwillingly unwittingly doctor our answers to questions like these is why we have the implicit association test, or IAT. The test was implemented in the late 1990s to try to gauge the implicit attitudes, identities, beliefs, and biases that people are unwilling or unable to report. You can take the IAT online and measure your implicit attitudes in all kinds of topics, from race, religion, and gender to disability, weight, and sexuality. It's basically a timed categorization task. For example, the age-related IAT looks at implicit attitudes about older versus younger people. In it, you might be shown a series of faces, old and young, and objects, pleasant and unpleasant, like pretty flowers versus a pile of garbage. You're then asked to sort these pictures, so you'd press the left key if you see a young face or a pleasant object, and press the right key if you see an old face or an unpleasant object. That's the stereotypic condition. Your keystrokes correspond to stereotypical pairs, in this case associating good stuff with youth and bad stuff with older age. Then the test asks you to do the same thing in a counter-stereotypic condition, pressing the left key if you see a young face or an unpleasant object, and the right key if you see an old face or a pleasant object. The core of the test is your reaction time. Are you faster at sorting when you're working with a stereotypical pairing than you are with counter-stereotypical pairings? If that's the case, even though you may think you're unprejudiced, you've got an implicit association between youth and goodness, which, as you might guess, may have some implications about how you think and act toward older people. The test is widely used in research, and contrary to what some critics think, it's surprisingly predictive of discriminatory behavior in all kinds of experimental settings. So that's one way to measure subtle implicit prejudice, but obviously overt prejudice is far from dead. That's why discrimination studies are prominent in social psychology research, and they can also predict, sometimes with scary accuracy, how discrimination might show up in broad social patterns, like wage inequality and job opportunity gaps. For instance, a 2012 study led by Yale social psychologist Corinne Moss-Rakusin demonstrated that science faculty across the country systematically discriminated against female science students. In a double-blind study, a representative sample of science faculty members were asked to hire a fictional student applicant for a lab manager job. When the applicant's name was Jennifer instead of John, they viewed her as less competent, were less likely to hire her, offered her less money, and were less likely to mentor her. And this prejudice was even exhibited by women faculty members. And that's an important point. People on both sides of the stereotype tend to respond similarly, with the subjects of prejudice themselves often holding the same stereotypical implicit attitudes or engaging in the same discriminatory behavior. So when we say that stereotypes are pervasive, we mean pervasive. Now, it's all too easy to hold up examples of how people are prejudiced, but the real root of the issue is why they are. Here are a few possibilities. For one, prejudices can come up as a way of justifying social inequalities. This happens when people on both sides of the power and wealth spectrum start believing that people get what they deserve, and they deserve what they get. This is called the just world phenomenon. Prejudices can also be driven by the us versus them, or as social psychologists often call it, the in-group, out-group phenomenon. Whether you're in a soccer stadium or the political arena or school lunchroom or, in the comments of this video, dividing the world into in-groups and out-groups definitely drives prejudice and discrimination. But an in-group identity also gives its members the benefits of communal solidarity and a sort of safety in numbers. This in-group bias, or tendency to favor your own group at the expense of others, is powerful even when it's totally irrational. One common social psychology exercise on in-group favoritism involves dividing a class into two arbitrary groups, say those wearing sneakers and those not wearing sneakers. Each person sits with his or her group and is told to list the differences between themselves and the opposing group. The lists usually start out pretty tame, but become more strident as they grow longer. Eventually, you have sneaker-wearing kids saying that they're just smarter than the people without sneakers, or kids who don't have sneakers say that the others are trashy and low class. Soon enough, each group has inflated itself and derided the opposing group, even though the division between the two was essentially meaningless to begin with. Little exercises like this illustrate the power of any in-group, out-group distinction in creating conflict between groups, and that brings us to the psychological nature of conflict itself. History is littered with examples of how the us versus them mentality has fueled violence and warfare, which is exactly what we'll be talking about next time. Today, you learned about how prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination affect how we interact and relate to one another. You learned how prejudice can often be non-conscious and automatic, and how tools like the implicit association test help reveal and measure it. We also looked at the implications of the in-group, out-group phenomenon and how it can lead to strong in-group bias that often turns aggressive. This episode of Crash Course Psychology was sponsored by Shane Barr, whose young adult sci-fi adventure book, Reset, is available on Amazon. Thanks for watching, especially to all of our subbable subscribers who make Crash Course possible. To find out how you can become a supporter or lead sponsor like Shane, just go to subbable.com/crashcourse. This episode was written by Kathleen Yale, edited by Blake DiPestino, and our consultant is Dr. Ranjit Bhagwat. Our director and editor is Nicholas Jenkins, the script supervisor and sound designer is Michael Aranda, and the graphics team is Thought Cafe.
In the world we live in, some people seem to think that they are better than other people. These people seem to believe that the world is split into different groups of people, called races. Some of these groups believe that they are more or less superior to other groups. For example, in the most common form of racism we can think of, day in, day out, black people are called rude words and often hurt by their white counterparts. When this occurs, and a certain group of people are treated unfairly compared to the people who mistreat them, it's called racism. Racism is a form of discrimination. Discrimination is where people, or some people, are treated badly or goodly based on a certain perceived feature of the person or those peoples. Racism is where people are treated badly or goodly based purely on race. Racism has been going on for years now, and it has influenced many events, such as the slave trade, which was when innocent Africans were taken by Europeans and forced to work in America as slaves. Or World War II, when the Nazis discriminated against Jewish people and many others. Plus the apartheid in South Africa. And of course, the civil rights movement in the USA. Because racism is a key factor, and a bad factor in all of these events, people around the world are trying to get rid of it. Most people agree that racism is a bad thing, and that people need to stand together against racism, and everybody needs to be treated the same in a good way. This is called equality. Thanks for watching, guys, and if you enjoyed this video, then please click the link here to subscribe. And don't forget to like, share, and comment on this video. Thanks for watching.